A billionaire's advice helped me go from an Ivy League reject to reaching my highest ambitions at the time, becoming a Stanford and Harvard-trained MD. Guy Hadelton, one of New Zealand's wealthiest individuals, taught me some of the secrets of his incredible success. Not only will I share the 3 secrets, but I'll also detail exactly how I implemented them so you can reach new heights in whatever field you're in. The first key to success is drive. What Guy said is that if you want to achieve anything, you have to first really want to achieve it. And so why is that? The reason is because naturally, we're not going to want to do the hard work necessary to be successful in the first place. So as creatures of evolution, we like to be comfortable, right? We want to have predictability, we want to have certainty. The challenge is that to achieve something that you've never achieved, you have to do something that you've never done. And so doing these new things is going to be scary. So the goal itself has to be so deeply meaningful to you that you're willing to push past that fear, not just once, but again and again and again. For me, I wanted to get into medicine. Why? The reasons were it combined my deep love of science and applying principles with the desire to help other people. And as someone who didn't have a lot of money growing up, it was also a good way for me to provide a solid, stable salary to provide for my family. It was really important for me to keep all of this in mind and the reasons behind me wanting to go to medicine, because I had to do some really uncomfortable things to get there. So for example, I have for a long time been terrified of what other people thought of me. In high school, I used to get palpitations, like my heart would just be beating out of my chest, and I would have really sweaty palms, and like my shirt would get all sweaty anytime I had to participate in a discussion, especially if we were talking about opinions or talking about like our own views on things. In college, however, because I had such a meaningful goal, right? I really wanted to go to a top medical school. What I wanted was more important to me than my worries about what others thought about me. And so because of that, I was able to put myself in some uncomfortable situations and still thrive. For example, anytime I didn't understand something in one of my classes, I would raise my hand and I would just ask. This, I know for some people is like not a big deal, but for me, this was like terrifying. Eventually though, because what I wanted was more important, I just kept doing it. And not only did I learn a ton, I learned that worrying about what other people thought about me didn't matter as much as me fixing the gaps in my knowledge. The second key to success is belief. And so what he said is that on top of really wanting something, you also have to really believe that you're capable of doing what it is that you've set your mind on. This in many ways was actually more challenging to me than drive. For me, I've always dealt with nearly crippling insecurities. As I mentioned before, the reason why I was so scared of discussions or of sharing my opinions in class was because I didn't really think that my opinions were good enough, right? And more broadly, I didn't feel like I was ever really good enough. So when he told me that I needed to really believe in myself, it was kind of a shock to the system. Not necessarily that like it didn't make sense, but just because it was something that I knew would be a big challenge for me. The more I thought about it though, the more I realized that he was onto something. Specifically, what I realized is that my own beliefs had often held me back. So for example, I didn't do very well on standardized exams. This was actually one of the biggest reasons why, despite the fact that I was valedictorian of my high school and I generally thought I knew the subjects that I studied pretty well, I didn't do very well on standardized exams. In retrospect, I think that part of the reason for this was that I had a limiting belief that I just wasn't smart enough, and that if I were smart enough, that I should be able to do well on the exam without studying. It was the classic fixed mindset. I was looking for the exam basically to be the sign that I was somehow good enough, that it was going to try and fix my belief that I was somehow inadequate, that it was going to prove to me somehow externally that the feelings of inadequacy were not justified. Also, because I didn't feel like I was good enough, I was also afraid of preparing, because preparing meant that I could actually fail. And if I tried and failed, it meant that I really wasn't good enough, right? And so there was also kind of this belief that, okay, like, because you're not good enough, like just don't try. Because if you don't try, then you can't really fail. So how did I end up believing in myself? First, I had to look at where my beliefs really came from. Beliefs, in my view, come partially from our experiences and partially from our assumptions. What do we mean by that? So in my view, our beliefs have to be grounded in part on experience, right? Obviously, it doesn't make sense to think that like, oh, if I just believe I can fly, like I'm gonna be able to fly, right? I have lots of experience showing me that not only can I not fly, but others can't fly. So belief in and of itself has to be grounded on at least in some part, experience. However, the breakthrough for me came when I realized that all belief systems and all bodies of knowledge, right, be they religion, be they philosophy, be they branches of science, they all have certain underlying assumptions, right? Even mathematics has assumptions, right? In math, we just call them axioms, but really these are things that we just accept to be true and we just don't try to prove them. They're just true, and we base off of all of these other things based on these assumptions. And so we have to choose the assumptions that are reasonable, right? We can't just like go off and choose some random sort of premise, but we still have to accept that there are assumptions that lie every system of belief. And so what I realized is that those assumptions are what color our perception. And in my case, I had just assumed that I wasn't good enough. Now, I know that this may be hard to believe coming from someone who scored in the top 0.1% on one of the hardest exams in the world, the USMLE Step 1, but if anything, it shows just how powerful the premises are that underlie our beliefs in ourselves. So the underlying belief that I wasn't good enough just colored everything, and there was nothing that I could do externally, and there was nothing that I could accomplish that could really dislodge that underlying premise about myself. So how did I start believing in myself? First, I started with the assumption that I was good enough. I just hadn't yet figured out the right skills to do well on standardized exams. Then I broke down everything that I got wrong and figured out exactly why it was that I got it wrong. So in order to do this, I had to learn how to be objective, right? It wasn't like I was just ignoring reality and pretending like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, like you are good enough, like rah, rah, like you're amazing. Instead, it was that I knew that I was good enough, and I just had to figure out how to turn myself into the kind of person, to develop the kinds of skills, to develop the right kinds of habits where that underlying goodness could show through. And so it meant that I had to be objective, right? I had to figure out what was problems of knowledge where it's like I just truly did not know it, and what was things of like carelessness where I just didn't read it carefully, and I had to figure out how to fix both of them. Slowly, by objectively looking at these things and breaking down like why I was getting questions wrong and what were the systematic errors that I was making, my scores improved and my belief in myself was solidified, right? Because again, beliefs are also based on experience, and so as my experience improved, my belief in myself grew even further, right? And so this created a virtuous cycle where I would believe in myself more, and then it became more exciting for me to work, and so I worked harder, and then when I worked harder, I would see even better results, and when I saw better results, I would feel even better about myself and have a greater belief in myself, and that caused me to work harder, right? And created this cycle where it just felt fun, right? Like studying suddenly became a lot more fun, and I started to look forward to taking practice questions, and I started to look forward to taking practice tests. The final key to success is consistency. Michelangelo said once that if you knew how much work went into it, you wouldn't call it genius. So in this final step, I'm going to tell you honestly the things that I did consistently that made me so much more successful academically than I had ever dreamed possible. And a lot of it came down to this final principle, just being consistent, right? Recognizing that it was easier to do something always or never than to rely on willpower alone to get it done. This was particularly important for someone who has ADHD. What I realized was that if I was going to rely on willpower, if I was going to rely on emotions or things like that, then it would be pretty short-lived. Like I would be able to maintain whatever it is that I was doing for a very short period of time. I had to figure out a way to really be consistent. And so the principle that I used to figure out what actions that I wanted to learn how to do consistently was I would ask myself, if I did this every day for the next month or the next year or the next X number of years, would it make a substantial difference in the outcome? If the answer to that question was yes, then I would basically work on establishing that behavior and making it a habit more than anything else. So for example, imagine this, like if every valuable bit of information or concept that you learned you never ever forgot for the rest of your life, how much do you think your knowledge would compound? Right? The answer to that is tremendously. Your knowledge would grow immensely if you just never forgot what it is that you learned. Because everything that you learned would make it so much easier to learn everything else related to that, and everything else that you learned related to that would make it so much easier to learn like the related topics to that. And so I did this, right? Once I learned about Anki flashcards, which is based on spaced repetition, where you can, once you learn something, you can efficiently retain it for, decades. I started to do it every single day. So like anytime I learned something interesting, anything I learned something that I knew would show up on a test later, either for one of my med school exams or for a big board exam, I would just make it a flashcard. I'd make sense of it. I would put it together, and then I would do those flashcards every single day. And my flashcards grew to maybe like 20,000 some cards, but because I was doing it consistently, Now I only have to do about 30 minutes a day of flashcards to remember just about everything that I've ever learned in the past. If you watch until the end, I'll link to another video where I talk about the biggest mistakes that people use when they're using Anki flashcards. Another question that I ask myself is, if I had more energy every time that I worked, how much more productive would I be? And so I realized that I could get a lot more done if I would study in the early morning as opposed to late in the day after I'd gotten home from a long day of class. So because of this, when I started out in medical school, I maintained a really strict sleep schedule. And I continued this basically through residency, where I would go to bed at about 8:30 or maybe 9. I'd wake up at maybe 4:30 or 5 in the morning, and then I would study for about 2 or 3 hours before I would go to class. Studying in the early morning as opposed to late at night made a huge difference in my productivity because I wasn't really distracted. I was able to focus a lot better, and it made a huge difference in how much I was able to accomplish. Another question I asked myself is, if I were to learn more per lecture, right, and had regular check-ins so that I never fell behind, how much better would I do? And the answer to that was obviously I would know a lot more. And so for college, I was consistent. I attended every single office hour for basically every single science class, and especially for the more challenging subjects like organic chemistry or molecular biology or physical chemistry. And so I would just go with questions to the professor because I knew that not a lot of people would necessarily go to the professor and ask them questions. And so it was almost like, free one-on-one tutoring with these PhD professors. And then in addition to that, in medical school, I took the same approach and I said, okay, well, I want to learn as much as I can from every single lecture. And so how do I do that? So I would go to the lecturer. So we would have like maybe 3 lectures per day in classes. And I made it a point to go up to the lecturer after every single lecture. And I would ask them questions. And throughout the lecture, I would basically be writing down questions in my margins of my notes, basically preparing to ask the professor later after the class was done. It got to the point where my friends who would be basically at home in their pajamas, like watching the lectures that were recorded, would tell me that like they would see me walk up to the professor after every single lecture, and they started to compliment me on it. And they would say like, wow, like I really admire the fact that like you're always there and you're always asking questions. And for me, it was just a way to force myself to pay attention. I knew that if I had to ask a question, that I had to actually semi-understand it in the first place to come up with a semi-intelligible question. And it also meant that I couldn't procrastinate because I have a natural tendency to, just put things off. So I was like, well, if I'm going to have to go to the office hours, I have to know it well enough that I can ask intelligible questions. And then the final way in which I applied this principle was I asked myself, okay, how can I focus better without distractions? What can I do to increase the quality of my attention for, the next several years? And so in residency, I actually chose to live, for example, on the subway. I did this because I wanted to study flashcards on the subway. In addition to this, I actually didn't own a smartphone. Like I didn't own a smartphone in med school. I didn't own a smartphone in college. I didn't own a smartphone in residency until like the very last year of residency. And the reason is because I knew that if I didn't have those distractions of a smartphone, that I could get a lot more done. These 3 secrets, drive, belief, consistency, can help just about anyone dramatically improve their effectiveness at chasing their dreams. Next, if you want to learn the secrets for how to remember anything that you've learned that's important, check out Med School Anki, Top Secrets and How to Avoid Them. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.